Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another lecture in Geography 341, Weather and Society. I'm Dr. Zach Hilgendorf, and in this lecture, we're going to be learning about something a little bit different. This is our second reading weather information, and this one is aptly titled, What's in a Name? And what we're meaning, or what we're referring to, are storm names. So, for example, Hurricane Katrina, or we'll hear of Winter Storm Mara, I believe is the name for it, and a couple of others. So, where do these names come from? Why do we name storms? And that's kind of what the focus is going to be for this lecture. So, hopefully, very interesting. I learned a lot when I was coming up with this lecture material and creating the lecture. So, I really hope you enjoy it. Maybe give a little bit more information on why we name storms and kind of the conventions behind it. So, enjoy, sit back, and let's get started. So, the outline for the lecture here, we're going to talk about naming storms, then we're going to talk about naming conventions. So, kind of go from history to practice, retiring names, because there are a fair amount of storms that are retired. You can no longer name them such. And then some modern shifts that are interesting that we'll kind of dive into on whether or not current trends in weather naming are positive, negative, we'll see. So, some interesting facts. So, we've been naming storms as far back as the 1500s, really back further than that in a lot of ways. But uh, one of the oldest named storms that we have on record is a hurricane that struck Puerto Rico on the 4th of October in 1526. It was happened to be the Catholic feast day for St. Francis of Assisi, and it was named San Francisco, obviously St. Francis, San Francisco, because that was the feast day. That's what they named it. In fact, most old storms like this, prior to formal naming conventions, tropical storms were usually named after places, objects, or feast days for saints. San Francisco, San Felipe, Santa Ana, all these different names. So the history of naming storms goes way back. Sometimes it was the Halloween blizzard of '91, which was a thing. Um, or I think there was one that was the schoolhouse blizzard, and this was back in the 1800s. So there are reasons for the names. A lot of times they're colloquial or based on a certain locale and experience that was well documented, and that's where the name was generated from. But formal naming conventions came into play a little bit later on, starting with this guy, Clement Lindley Wragg. He lived 1852 to 1922, pardon me. Very interesting individual. English born, moved to Australia and worked for the South Australian Surveyor General's Department. And he actually had a pretty broad career in meteorology, stemming all the way back to the UK. He had a bunch of different weather stations set up all over Britain, or helped set up stations all over Britain. Uh, Set them up all over Australia, set them up all over New Zealand, all of these different places during his tenure, these weather observation stations to help people document and record weather that was ongoing. Now, an interesting bit on Clement's history. He's widely credited as the first meteorologist to officially name storms. Now, that's a pretty cool claim to fame. Started off using Greek and Roman mythological figures. Think of things like the gods, Zeus, Hercules, like all these different types of things. However, he was a big proponent and trying very hard to establish the Australian Meteorological Bureau from a government perspective. He was pushing to pass that entity through to the federal government. And he was passed over for the position when it came time for them to choose the lead meteorologist of the newly formed Australian Meteorological Bureau. So, in spite of those people, he started naming storms in the southern hemisphere after Australian politicians to smear their names a little bit or associate their names with some maybe less than savory things like destructive tropical storms. Um, but all that aside, Clement Lindley Wragg is basically the first person to have a naming convention for storms. And This was something that was pretty widely used during his tenure in the Surveyor General's department in Australia. There was a bit of a hiatus, but then it was kind of picked back up again. Now, fast forward a few years. So he lived until 1922. Uh, it kind of fell out of use for a little while. And then we get to the 1940s. And the United States Air Force Miami, Florida office started naming storms using the phonetic alphabet or phonetic spelling alphabet. At the time, that was a little bit different because it was things like Abel, Baker, Charlie, Dog, Easy, Fox. Those were, your A, B, C, D, E, and F uh, phonetic spelling or phonetic alphabet of the day. Now, one of the big problems was that the radio operators, there was confusion there. If they were trying to spell out something using that phonetic alphabet, and there was a storm that happened to be going on, there was worry and concern that it would lead to confusion amongst operators and kind of belabor or labor the point of trying to get across something efficiently and effectively, as is often the case with rapid military transmission. It was changed to a less anglicized version, Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta Echo Foxtrot, later on. But the United States Air Force then switched to using female names of the day to avoid confusion during radio communications. And this was really the first devoted effort or devoted choice to name things in that way. 1947 marks the first hurricane season labeled by the United States Air Force. So that's when we started off with Tropical Storm Baker. There was Tropical Depression Abel, and Tropical Storm Baker, Hurricane Charlie. These were the first ones that really came out. Shortly thereafter, they switched to naming things after female names. So fast forward a little bit, back to forward to the 1950s. So in the early 1950s, United States meteorologists realized that short, easy to remember names were a very simple and effective way to communicate potential impacts of major storms. The idea being, if you can, promote something that's quick, easy, a short name, Alice, Sue, Hazel, things like that, then you're able to effectively communicate that that storm is on its way and could pose a potential impact, severe or not, to a certain area. 1953, the National Hurricane Center exclusively started naming storms after female names. Kicking off that list was Tropical Storm Alice. That was the first named storm of the 1953 season using this particular naming convention. The final hurricane, not tropical storm, I think there's one or two after this, but the final hurricane was Hurricane Hazel, which I kind of find funny because that's the name of my infant. So Hurricane Hazel was the final hurricane of that season. Now, really cool. This is a publication from immediately after that storm season. So this came out in 1954. And what we're looking at here are tracks of hurricanes that occurred during the 1953 season. Now, there are three of note, and I'll mention why here in a second, but they include Hurricane Carol, Hurricane Edna, and Hurricane Hazel. So keep those in mind. But these three tracks were particularly destructive, we'll say. And I won't spoil it yet. We'll give it a few more slides. Let's fast forward another 20 or so years. So here we are in the 1970s. In 1977, control of naming storms like this was actually transferred to the newly founded World Meteorological Organization's Hurricane Committee, the WMO, World Meteorological Organization. They kind of took control. So 1978, they actually started alternating between female and male names for northern Pacific storms. Soon after, 1979, this naming convention was adopted for the Atlantic Basin. So instead of just having storms named after females, we have a mix now, female and male names, or typically female and male names, which led to kind of our standard naming criteria and conventions. So the World Meteorological Hurricane Committee determines a pre-designated list of hurricane names for 6-year periods. Alternate name lists exist in the in the event that tropical storms for the year exceed 21 tropical storms. You might say that's a weird number. Why 21? Well, there are 26 letters in our alphabet, and the letters Q, U, X, Y, and Z are omitted. They're excluded from consideration because they're typically deemed a little bit too tough to come up with names for that fit the criteria of short, easy to remember names. And it's that short, distinctive name type, names that are chosen for easy conveyance of information. They start at the beginning of the season with alphabetical naming nomenclature. The first storm is going to start with a name like Alice or Ave or Alice or Anne or things like that. And then it'll go from there. So if you think back, K, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, the 11th storm, Hurricane Katrina would have been the 11th storm of that season that reached that naming requirement. Now, speaking of Hurricane Katrina and many others, there are retired names. And names were initially retired starting with the 1954 season. So in 1955, the U.S. Weather Bureau began to retire names. Now, remember I told you to remember Carol, Edna, and Hazel. Well, these were the first three names retired because they were major hurricanes that caused a severe amount of damage and death. So originally retired names were allowed back after roughly a 10-year hiatus, but this was never actually put into practice. In 1969, before those names could rotate back through, the policy changed to a permanent retirement so that 10 years down the road, you couldn't have another Hurricane Katrina, for example. The World Meteorological Organization can retire any name if it is felt that the storm is so deadly or damaging that its continued or future use would be deemed inappropriate or perhaps insensitive. That's why Hurricane Katrina, you'll never have another Hurricane Katrina, because it was so destructive and so devastating that it was retired from use. They can also be retired if the name is too similar to another name, for example, or it may suggest an inappropriate meaning in another language. So maybe a little bit of brevity there. If somebody finds out that one of the words that they've been using was a swear word in another language, well, there's reason to take it out of the mix. So the fact that that is included means it must have happened, but I couldn't find information on that particular fact other than just the listing there. And actually, the Greek alphabet was retired from use in 2020. So there were storms now and then that were using the Greek alphabet, but after a while that was retired. Now, by basin, these are the number of retired names as of 2022. In the Atlantic Basin, we've got 94 storms that have been names that have been retired. The East and Central Pacific, another 19. The West Pacific, 65. The South Pacific, 103. The Philippines, 71. And Australia, 114. So at all these basins, that's the number of storm names, more or less, that have been retired. Now, there are slight deviations on naming conventions across the world, but the broad sense, this is a pretty accurate accounting of retired names. So modern shifts have kind of brought about some differences in how we name and consider storms. So we've seen in recent times winter storms and heat waves starting to be named. Now, this isn't a practice that's sanctioned or supported by the World Meteorological Organization. In fact, they've gone on to say what has been established for tropical cyclone events may not necessarily translate easily across to, in this case, heat waves. The agency said, caution should be exercised when comparing or applying lessons or protocols from one hazard type to another due to the important differences in the physical nature and impacts of storms and heat waves. So the reason I bring this up is because we just had our first named heat wave. And because the Weather Channel, not, a government affiliated entity, has been naming winter storms as far back as 2011. So let's dive into that just a little bit and kind of see some of the examples of this here. We see often that tweet on the right there, up to 1 foot of hashtag snow for parts of New England as winter storm hashtag Bill tracks northeast this weekend. Expect travel delays. This was from the 2nd of January in 2015. So heat wave Zoe in 2022 was the first named heat wave. Now, this came about because of a kind of collaborative scientific endeavor to raise awareness for heat wave severity, because there's a lot of associated health risks when it comes to heat waves, aside from just heat stroke. Um, but Seville, Spain became the first city to designate that name. So this came, here we can see a map of Europe and extreme maximum temperatures in degrees Celsius between July 17th and the 23rd. Now, the naming, I think, technically happened on July the 24th, but we can see Spain was in the hottest, some of the hottest temperatures that were being recorded across Europe during this summer heat wave. Heat waves of category 3 will receive names. We can see this little graphic on the side here. Category 0, high temperatures, health risks for vulnerable communities. Category 1, very high temperatures, follow the guidelines and avoid prolonged exposure to heat, inform vulnerable community members. Category 2, exceptionally high temperatures, health risks, take precautions, prepare to help the most vulnerable. And Category 3, extreme temperatures, major health risks, take maximum precautions. So there are a list of other names that may be used in the case that heat waves are continued to be named. And that kind of gets at an interesting question of why are we naming things that are not tropical cyclones? Because that's really what the naming convention was developed for. Well, winter storms were the start to that deviation. So here we can see the most recent one. This was Winter Storm Mara. That happened a couple of, well, as of this recording in mid-March, about a month and a half ago, if I remember right, towards the end of January. 2010 to 2011 winter was the first winter where a person-based naming scheme was used by the Weather Channel. And this came on the heels of Twitter being a powerhouse of communication at the time. Being able to hashtag something was easy, it was quick, it drew attention to it, and it was popular. So what ended up happening was the Weather Channel, in order to effectively communicate about these types of storms, started naming them, much like you see in tropical cyclones, because the idea is there. If you give it a name, people associate with it, people can connect with it, they can discuss it amongst other people in an effective manner. So much like the Atlantic and Pacific, it avoids names on the 6 lists for the Atlantic storm names, the Eastern Pacific storm names, and any of the retired names as well. And it also avoids names that are long or bad for hashtagging, basically. But the idea here is that they have a rotating list that changes every couple of years, and if you work through that list, you move on to the next one. So the idea is kind of interesting because it leads to the question of really what's in a name. And that, as I kind of titled our little talk here, because we name things in a way, at least from a psychological perspective, we name it so that we can associate with it, so that it gives it a persona, if you will, that we can talk about. Hurricane Katrina was particularly devastating or wicked, so that's what you associate that with. Or Hurricane Mara Winter Storm Mara was this way, or Heat Wave Zoe was, particularly devastating. It's a shorthand way to convey information amongst our peers. And that brings us on to a random assignment for this one. Now, there are 2 articles, and I want you to pick one of them. They are almost the exact same length. I want you to read either Rainier et al., What's in a Name, or What's in a Hashtag Name, pardon me, an experimental study examining perceived credibility and impact of winter storm names. This was in the journal Weather, Climate, and Society in 2017. Or I would like you to read Jung et al. In 2014, Female Hurricanes Are Deadlier Than Male Hurricanes. Now, both of these kind of deal with different topics. The top one is kind of looking at, was the Weather Channel's method of naming things actually effective? Has it changed awareness or perceived credibility or impact? The second one, Jung et al., is kind of interesting from a psychological or maybe sociological perspective, because that one deals with perceived impacts and perceived threats from these different named storms. Whether you have, and unfortunately, that they argue is that female named storms are typically looked at as less serious or less threatening. And they argue that there's a chance that that has led to greater risk and greater devastation because people don't want to move out of the way, like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, versus male storm names, which people often associate with larger or more aggression. So what I want you to do is write a full 1-page response, 1-inch margins, 1.5 times spacing, 12-point Arial font, and submit that by the deadline listed on Canvas. But I hope you have fun with these. These are both fascinating articles. I would invite you to read both of them, but I only want you to pick one of them. They're both listed on Canvas. You can look and read the abstracts and kind of go from there. They both have a bunch of pictures and all that kind of stuff, so don't worry about that. But I hope you found this video interesting. Forward a little bit here. There we go. I hope you found this video interesting. It was kind of a different one. It's one I'd wanted to do because it's such a fascinating topic of what is the kind of method behind naming things, and why do we, and it kind of all gets at the human need to give order to chaos. And in this chance, or in this example, chaos is our weather and our weather patterns, and being able to give them a name allows us to associate with them in some way, shape, and or form, or communicate them better to our peers. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And I will see you in the next one, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.